Jerusalem Press Club.
Many,
Welcome
many.
to the annual briefing with the governor of the Bank of Israel, Dr. Karnit Flug. Please turn off your phones or switch them to silent mode, please. And you all received in the invitation, you received the CV, so I'll stick to the highlights. Dr. Flug has been the governor of the Bank of Israel since November 2013. Before they worked in the bank, she received the MA in economics cum laude from the Hebrew University and her PhD in economics from Columbia University. Worked some time at the IMF, then came back into the Bank of Israel, again in the American Development Bank, and as I said, since 2013, the governor of the bank. We thank you for coming. This has been a tradition. Once a year, you come to present the economic, a tour of the horizon of our economics, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I guess I should speak on here. So, yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. As you said, oh, it's a pleasure, but this is not coming fine. I don't see the screen. Okay,
Don't see the screen.
I don't see the presentation on the screen.
Okay, so we'll fix it. Show me.
Okay, I think I can start. יש לי. No, I need to. Okay. So, but it has been a tradition for me as well. It's my third time here, so
Indeed.
it's great to see you all. Maybe I should start because you can see the presentation. I can't see, but I can go back. So I'll start with the macroeconomic situation, and then move to talk a little bit about some of the areas of strength and some of the challenges that the Israeli economy is facing. In terms of the macroeconomic situation, growth has been relatively strong. In fact, this year, or 2016, ended with a growth rate of 3.8%, which is beyond the growth rate of most advanced economies, also beyond what was projected earlier on. זה פחות טוב, כי זה עכשיו... אוקיי. And אולי אתה יכול... אני אסתדר, רק תמחוק את הדבר הזה, אני אסתדר, אוקיי? It's okay. It's okay. You can generally see that the cycle of the Israeli economy is very much connected to the global economy cycle, and you can see at the very end the pickup in the growth rate of the Israeli economy for 2016. So I can say generally that this is an indication that we are at a strong macroeconomic situation. The main way by which the Israeli economy is connected to the global economy is through exports. And you can actually see on the right-hand side that very broadly our exports, Israel is always marked in blue, are more or less in line, move more or less in line with the global trade in goods and services, if we look at them together. Although recently there was some underperformance of our exports, actually in the years 2015 and the beginning of 2016, our exports underperformed relative to the global trade. But when we divide, this is on the right-hand side. When we look separately, it's the trade in services and in goods, what we can see is that actually the Israeli services, the exports of Israeli services went up very sharply, more than global trade in services. That's mostly business services, which tend to be high-tech. And the goods exports has been somewhat weaker than that of goods trade in, at least in the advanced economies. So what we can see generally is that our services have been doing very well, goods exports less so. If we look at the geographical distribution of the destination of our exports, what you can see is generally that the geographical composition of our exports in goods are sort of very evenly distributed, about 1/4 to the US, a little bit more than that to Europe, and the rest is sort of broadly distributed across the globe. Our exports of services are more concentrated in the traditional markets, basically the US and Europe, where almost 2/3 of our exports go to these sort of more traditional advanced economies destinations. Labor market. One indication of the very strong performance of the Israeli economy is the developments in the labor market. And actually, here what you can see is, first of all, that our unemployment, and I'm talking about unemployment of people aged 25 to 64, is at a record low of 3.8%. That's at the end of last year. And that has happened, the decline in unemployment happened in spite of the fact that more and more people are joining the labor market. And in fact, the participation rate reached a record high of 80%. That's high relative to most advanced economies. And that's in spite of the fact that we have some groups that tend to have low rates of participation, in particular the ultra-orthodox men and Arab women. In spite of the performance of these two groups, when we look at the overall, we see very high rate of participation. And these new entrants to the labor market were well absorbed into employment, and you can see the very sharp and continuous growth of employment. So the labor market is actually warming up. We're approaching full employment, much lower employment than most advanced economies. And it's also manifested in the rise in wages. And if we look at the real wages over time, you can see a fairly sharp increase in the last actually 2 years, and especially in the last year, where the business sector wages are actually leading the way. Over the last 12 months, they rose by 3.7%. So there are indications that the labor market is sort of quite tight, warming up. And in fact, we start seeing some shortages of labor in some occupations, in some branches of the economy. So we're certainly in a strong and tight labor market. That obviously is relevant. First of all, it's good news in terms of the economy and in terms of people's improvement in wages and in the standard of living. It's also very relevant for us when we're thinking about monetary policy, and I'll get to that in a minute. A few words about the financial sector. And as you know, I think last time when I was here, I talked about the discussions that were then going on about the financial sector reforms, and I'll say a few words about that in a minute, but let me first just sort of give you an overview regarding how the financial sector has changed over time. What you can see here is the sources of credit or the distribution of credit to the non-financial sector by lender. And generally, one can see here that the banks are still quite dominant in terms of their provision of credit, but their share has somewhat declined over time if we look at the last 16 years. They're still dominant, especially when we're thinking about credit to households and mortgages. They're less dominant in terms of provision of credit to large companies, where actually institutional investors have increased their share. So this is sort of just an overview of who are the main providers of credit to the non-financial sector. When we look at another aspect of the financial sector, is who is managing actually the assets of the public, and you see here again a change over time of the distribution of where the assets of the public are being managed, and you can see some decline in the dominance of the banks. That's the blue part. By the way, within the banks, you can see that there is a much higher share of current account, and that's related to the fact that our interest rate is very low, so people are actually keeping some of their resources in a current account. But more broadly, there was a substantial increase in the share of institutional investors. That's part of a reform that took place in that area, the Bahar reform, and also the fact that we have a compulsory pension saving, which basically is funneled into the management by institutional investors. So this is sort of a very broad overview of the financial sector and its structure. I mentioned already some reforms that had been contemplated and have been now advanced towards the beginning of implementation. The legislation for most of the things that I put on this graph has already passed towards the end of last year. And there are various elements in this reform that are expected to enhance the competition in the financial sector, and in particular in the provision of credit. So some of these reforms have to do with structural changes that are expected to actually reduce the barriers from the entry of new companies as credit providers. That's including the first line here, that the legislation to actually separate the credit card companies from the largest banks, from the two largest banks. And they, as separate companies, will be entities which will add to the competition as competitors to the banks. We also think that these credit companies have the potential to become actually banks over time. We also, by regulation, changes in the regulation of the banking supervision, will reduce the barriers for new banks to start actually operating. And we think that with the technological advancement, with the fact that now actually more of the banking services are provided via digital banking, and with the additional reduction of requirements for new banks, at least at their initial phase of operation, we will start seeing additional players in the system. Another very important element that we believe will enhance the competition in the credit area is the establishment of a credit registry. And actually, the Bank of Israel took upon itself to actually create this credit registry with information that will allow to actually calculate a credit score by these credit bureaus that are expected to start operating, and that will help people actually shop for the lowest cost of credit. So this is a very yet additional element, important element for the enhancement of competition in the credit area. There are some additional steps in the area of payment services. And the last element, which has yet to be established, is the establishment of Financial Stability Committee, which is being actually, the draft of the law is ready, and we hope actually to pass that law pretty soon. We think that a Financial Stability Committee, which will coordinate among all the regulators, will monitor risks, will identify them early, and will be able to act early, is extremely important in any case, and in particular in a financial system that undergoes changes, substantial changes. So the importance of this body, which will monitor risks, is of very significant importance actually at this particular time. So we very much hope to be able to complete that regulation in a short time. Let me move to monetary policy. So I already talked about the state of the economy. We operate our monetary policy within the context of inflation targeting. And in the law, actually, we have very clear specification of what are the targets of monetary policy, and they include price stability, support of the main economic policy objectives of the government, and also the support of the stability of the financial sector. So we already talked about the strengths of the economy, the strengths of the labor market and employment. As you all know, inflation has been very, very low over the last more than 2 years. Actual inflation has been negative over the last 2 years, where our target is for an inflation of between 1% and 3%. So we've been undershooting our target quite substantially. Over the last 2 years, there were several forces that actually depressed inflation. The reduction in prices of energy and commodities actually until the last year or so, when they started moving back. But these effects actually filter through over a longer period of time to inflation. There was also a set of decisions taken by the government to reduce administered prices, starting with a reduction in the VAT and several other price reductions that have been influencing inflation over the last 2 years. We believe actually that with the fact that the labor market is getting tighter and wages are moving up, that we will start seeing a gradual increase of inflation, and it will get into the target range towards the end of this year. So there are forces now working in that direction, and actual inflation, although it's still negative, has been very gradually moving up. The other element that is actually working towards reducing inflation is the more, I would say, enhanced competitiveness within various sectors in the economy. It's something that we've seen actually starting to act since 2011's protest about prices, and we see in various sectors of the economy more competition that is working towards reducing prices. We also see expanded competition by purchases from the internet and other sources. So we think that there are forces working in both directions. However, it's important to note that in spite of the fact that actual inflation has been undershooting for a long time, when we look at inflationary expectations, those that we derived from the market, they have been within the target range throughout the period. So the public does see the low inflation as something that is temporary, and the credibility of the inflation targeting regime has been maintained. And we, as I said, expect inflation, with the help of our policy, to be back within the inflation target towards the end of this year. Another very important variable that affects both inflation and the performance of the economy is the exchange rate, and we focus on the exchange rate, on the nominal effective exchange rate, which is basically a weighted average of the exchange rate of the shekel vis-a-vis the currencies of our main trading partners, predominantly the US dollar and the euro, but not only. As you know, we have, as I showed before, we have a very broad range of trading partners. And as you all know, the shekel has been actually strengthening for a long time, less so vis-a-vis the US dollar, more so vis-a-vis the weakening euro. But when we look at this weighted average, we see a sort of a gradual appreciation or strengthening of our shekel. That has an effect both on inflation. It's one of the factors that actually keep inflation down, and it also has an effect on the competitiveness of our export sector. Here I should note that there are various factors that are actually affecting the exchange rate. Some of them are fundamental. We have a large current account surplus, and overall our economy is doing very well. But there are also non-fundamental factors that affect the exchange rate, and they have to do with the fact that some of our trading partners maintain an extremely expansionary monetary policy, including the negative interest rate by the ECB, quantitative easing. The Japanese central bank is also holding negative interest rates and has very aggressive expansionary policy. So this is part of the environment that obviously we have to take into account when we conduct our policy. One last element before I talk about the policy itself that we also take into account is the developments in the housing market and in the mortgage market. And as you are all aware, housing prices here have been going up continuously at a rapid pace, and with that we've seen also a substantial expansion in the mortgages provided to the public. And this is one of the areas which we think that has some financial stability risks that have to do with the expansion of mortgages that have become actually a substantial portion of the overall credit provided by banks. So these are all the background or all the elements of the picture that the Monetary Policy Committee is analyzing when it decides about its policy. So the first element of the policy is interest rate, and the interest rate has been at 0.1% now for quite a long time. And we also stated, the Monetary Policy Committee stated, that it will maintain the expansionary monetary or accommodative monetary policy stand for a considerable time, given the picture that I have actually described to you. A second element of our monetary policy is the intervention in the foreign exchange market. And we intervene when we think that the forces towards strengthening the shekel are beyond what the fundamentals or the fundamental economic forces justify. And I already mentioned the extreme expansion of monetary policy of some of our trading partners as one element that also adds to the pressure towards strengthening of the shekel, and we've been actually active in offsetting some of that. The third element, which has to do with financial stability, is a set of macroprudential measures or limitations on mortgages that we have applied over the years, and they're still in place. And they include limits on the loan to value, on the payment to income, on the share of variable rate mortgages within every mortgage, so as to avoid a very sharp increase in the payments once eventually interest rates will move up. And we also require the banks to set sufficient cushions of capital for the potential event if actually instability in that market occurs. So this is the set of policies that we've been applying, and let me maybe now move on to some longer or some other issues, and I'll say a few words about fiscal policy. You probably know that unlike in many other central banks, in Israel, the governor is also the economic advisor to the government. So if in other places central bank governors refrain from talking about fiscal policy, here it's actually part of my job, so I do have a view about fiscal policy as well. Exactly. So the government actually follows a fiscal rule which determines the ceiling of the fiscal deficit, and now we have a 2-year budget that was just passed at the end of the year with a fiscal deficit ceiling of 2.9%, which is somewhat higher than the deficit over the last 2 years, but that's a ceiling. A very important development over the years in Israel has been the decline in the debt to GDP ratio. In fact, in that respect, we moved exactly to the opposite direction than most industrial countries. If I would put here the average of the debt to GDP ratio of the OECD countries, you'd see actually a scissors move, where we moved up and most advanced economies moved, we moved down, and most advanced economies actually have a much higher debt to GDP ratio now. So this is a very important development because it basically creates, I would say, some fiscal space, which is very important for a country like Israel that is, I would say, shock prone of various natures. When we look at the other aggregates, actually the tax burden in Israel is not high when we compare to other countries. This is not the sense of most Israelis, but when we look at the overall tax collection within GDP, it's actually quite low relative to most advanced economies, much lower than the average. There is nothing saint in the average, but I think that it's an indication that tax burden in Israel is not high. We also overall public expenditure in Israel is actually significantly lower than in most advanced economies, and that's in spite of the fact that we have high defense spending and still high, actually, interest rate spending on the historical debt. So what is left to the civilian public spending is actually very, very modest. We spend less than 30% of GDP compared to almost 42% for the average OECD country. So if you have a sense that overall civilian public services in Israel are not of the highest quality, there is a reason for that. And we think that our education is not doing a good enough job to ensure actually high enough standards of our kids. I would say our health system is still good, but it's very overcrowded, and we don't invest enough to make sure that actually it will continue to provide high quality services in the future. Our welfare system is very, very tight, I would say stingy. And there are other social and civilian services that are of insufficient quantity and quality, and it has to do with the level of spending. I think in some areas it actually is clearly detrimental to growth. I think that a country that relies on high-tech and human capital has to, in order to maintain this comparative advantage, has to do better in the educational system, and also the area of infrastructure. There is quite a lot to be done to actually make it easier for the private sector to actually have more efficient investments here. I would like to go through some of the areas of the strength of the Israeli economy and then say a few words about the challenges. So, as you know, Israel is a country that has comparative advantage in some of the high-tech sectors, and obviously the share of highly educated population is a very important, or I would say a key element there. By the way, here I should mention that the wave of immigrants from the former Soviet Union in the 90s was very important in creating this picture. A lot of them came with very technical education that was very important in the evolution of the high-tech sector. When we look at international scores of innovation, Israel actually ranks highly in most of these rankings. By some rankings it ranks as second or 10th, but I think that what is behind this high place or high rank in Israel has to do with the quality of our academic institutions and the tight connection between the academia and the industry, the relevant industry, which actually this collaboration between the universities and industry is one element of strength that actually helps the innovation scene get strengthened. Large R&D spendings. Earlier on, they were more based on government spending. Now it's mostly the industry which spends on R&D. And also a very strong venture capital industry that basically provides the financing for most of this activity. Just to give you a few numbers to sort of give an indication of the strengths of this innovative technology-based industry, very large numbers of companies listed on the NASDAQ. 300 international companies actually established their R&D centers in Israel, and that's in the area of fintech and clean tech and cyber and agrotech and so on and so forth. I'm sure you're familiar with them, some of them. 5,000 startups. It's the largest concentration of startups, except for Silicon Valley. One of the areas I mentioned already is cybersecurity, where we have more than 400 companies. I think these numbers speak for themselves. Large number of patents which are actually which are registered in different places. And I like to give this example of the water industry, where I think the combination of need, Israel is mostly desert, together with innovation and together with technology actually combines to a very successful story where technologies such as desalination, water waste recycling, drip irrigation, and so forth actually solve the problem of water shortage in Israel and are very useful also for other parts of the world. Let me just mention one more thing. Actually, the number of startups in Israel is very, very large, but I think one of the important things to note about startups is that most of them are bound to fail. And I think there is something about the willingness to actually try ideas, be willing to take a risk. Many of these startups fail, but in the process, people are learning from that and are moving to the next startup. And I think, as we know, some of these very small number of successful startups are extremely successful, and in terms of the financial value, they're very impressive. But it's the willingness to take risks that I think actually serves this industry in a very positive way. But there are also challenges, and as I talk about them quite a bit, so let me say a few words about them. We've seen already the very successful and vibrant, innovative part of the economy, but when we look at the economy as a whole, the output per worker or productivity is not moving forward so as to close the gap vis-a-vis the most advanced economies. Actually, the areas where we don't export but focus on the local market, many of these industries have relatively low productivity compared to the same industries in other countries. So where we look at the world, we actually are doing very well. When we compete, we're doing very well. When the very local industries are not doing great. And when we think of reasons for this productivity gap, there are various sources for this productivity gap. Some of them has to do with human capital. We've seen that we have very high share of tertiary educated population, but when we look at the results of standardized tests for the grown-up population, and actually being part of the OECD allows us to actually look at our results compared to other countries. We see that in standardized tests of problem solving in a technological environment, the score of the Israeli labor force is quite low. That's on the upper right-hand side. The level of investment and the capital per employee post is relatively low. We're also not making it easy for other countries to compete in Israel. And actually, when we look at OECD trade facilitation indicators, which is a sort of an average of a set of indicators that looks at non-tariff barriers, we actually see that we're not making it easy for competitors from abroad to actually come and compete here. And our doing business score, which is basically checking the level of over regulation and bureaucracy, we've actually went down or moved up in the score, which is very bad news. So we have an inefficient, I would say, a lot of red tape and over-regulated economy. So these are areas that have to be dealt with if we want to move up in the productivity area. Another substantial challenge for the Israeli economy and society is the fact that we have a very diverse population, and I already mentioned the Arab women and ultra-orthodox men who have very low rates of employment. And the fact that it's moving up is no consolation, because as you see, the gap is still very, very substantial, and it's a growing share of our population. So I think we have to step up the efforts to actually provide these groups with the skills necessary for successful integration in the labor market. And some of these indicators are actually manifesting themselves in the fact that we have high rates of poverty. It's a relative measure of poverty, and also high level of income inequality. And they are related to what I've shown here in the labor market, and also to the fact that our welfare system, as I mentioned, is quite, I would say, stingy. So, to sum up, our macroeconomic situation is very good, and I think the economy has great potential, but we only utilize a portion of our strength and of our resources. And if we want to have an inclusive growth, which means that all parts of the society will enjoy the fruits of the growth, and if we want to have sustainable growth, we have to actually have a persistent policy in the areas of our challenges. And I think because of our good macroeconomic situation, this is the time to actually deal with these challenges, which have to do with the inefficient regulation and the need to increase investment, both in human capital, in infrastructure, and in reducing the regulatory burden. So I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I couldn't but peep into your notes here, and it says in the preparation, 45 minutes. It was exactly 45 minutes, so I wish everything in Israel would be
as precise.
Thank you. Yuval, please.
Allow me to address.
Maybe I'll just sit.
Hold on one second. Yeah, sit and have some water.
Yes.
I'd like to get an answer for you from you as the economic advisor to the government. I have two questions. One is your, I would say, lukewarm criticism of the government of Israel's invention of a two-year budget, especially in view of the unforeseen changes in our area and in our economy. For us to have a two-year budget just in order to save Mr. Netanyahu the need to bring the changes in the budget to a vote, I think is a high risk. The second one is, I haven't heard your criticism of the government policy in order to bribe parties in the coalition, they are given hundreds of millions of shekels to do their own budgeting, which is to their favorite causes, rather than to the causes which the government of Israel needs or foresees and gets a vote of confidence. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I can address
Yeah, one
by one.
at a
Okay.
time.
Regarding the two-year budget, I think that there are some risks in presenting a two-year budget. I think that some of them were addressed within the budget by increasing the reserve within the budget. The main risk is that you will not foresee or that your ability to actually forecast the revenues within a two-year budget is somewhat more limited, but that was addressed, to my view, in a reasonable way in increasing the internal reserve within the budget and also providing some I would say, ability to actually introduce measures if the forecast diverges from if the actual revenue.
The cuts on economic service, on social service.
Well, as I mentioned, I think it's not the biggest challenge of economic policy in Israel. I think the two-year budget was a decision that is not mostly on economic grounds, but I think it's not, I think there are other, I would say, policy issues that are, in my view, more crucial in terms of actually economic policy in Israel. Regarding the coalition money, we've seen that around every formation of coalitions. In terms of the quantity, I don't think it was different than after most elections. So I'm looking at the actual distribution of the budget, and it has not been in terms of the overall size of the budget, not that effective in terms of changing the, I would say, the priorities within the budget.
Next. Yes, please.
Two questions. In terms of the investment in education that you mentioned, or the lack of investment in education, do you see problems with investment in school and high school education, or is it in university education, or is it both? Where should the government place its resources, and how much do you think is lacking? Is it 50%? Is it 100%? What do you think the government needs to do in those areas to increase? My second question is...
Wait a second.
Okay. On education, actually, the area where we are at the largest gap in terms of spending per pupil is in not in university, but in the lower levels of education. And in university spending, we actually used to have higher spending than the average, and now it's converged actually to what is spent on average in other advanced economies. But I think, and I don't have a number in my head, but I think that given that, again, the advantage of being in the OECD is that you can get a good sense of where you are far from the standards. But I should also mention that it's not sufficient just to increase the spending. You have to do it in an effective and efficient way. So I think some changes in the way the system operates need to also be, taken.
My second question is about the deregulation of the pension market. As you said, there's a big reform there a few years ago. But I now am working on a story of horror stories of young people being sold policies by private pension companies that they then find years later they've signed standing orders allowing these pension companies to take whatever amount of money they want from their accounts whenever they want it, ending up with huge debts. Are you satisfied with the regulation of the pension market at the moment?
It's, as you know, there is a special regulator that actually regulates the pension, the institutional investors. And I'm not familiar with the details that you were discussing, but I think generally the regulation there is very important. I can't comment on specifics that I'm not aware of.
Yes, please.
Thank you for a very clear picture that you gave us. One of your suggestions was a financial stability committee.
Right.
Would such a committee be composed of government officials, or were you thinking of more industrial personalities or private people? Who would be members of such a committee?
Okay. As in other places, the committee is comprised of people from the central bank and the government and all the regulators. So it's expected to be actually led by the central bank governor. And then the members would be all the regulators of the various parts of the financial system. And it's a committee that is not taking away from the actually from the authority of any of the regulators, but it allows to actually monitor and transfer information when you see some part, within some part of the financial system, some stability problems, it can actually move across the system quite rapidly, and that's what we've learned also from the financial crisis. So this transfer of information and early action can be very important. But it's it's the regulators.
I have a question.
Sure.
Do you consider a committee to reduce regulation? Because
Actually,
I think that's a big problem in itself.
Well, there are actually the head of the Prime Minister's office is leading efforts to reduce regulation. I agree, and I think the indicators suggest that there are a lot of areas where there is a lot of room for reducing and making them more consistent. And actually, one of our problems is that any business that is trying to set up has to deal with at least 10 or 12 different regulators. Each of them is doing their job, but they can be very inconsistent, and nobody actually takes into account the price of the fact that this business will just not be set up because of the many demands.
Right.
So, yeah.
Next.
Why has the Bank of Israel not intervened in the binary options scam?
Actually, it's not part of
Say again?
in the binary.
Bank of Israel permitting the scam of binary options.
Yeah, it's not within our jurisdiction. It's actually within the area of the ICC, and I think they've been the Securities Authority, and to the best of my knowledge, they're looking into it and they are concerned, but it's not within our mandate. We regulate only the banks. I mean,
I have a couple of questions as well. We'll start with the bank's economists expect a quarter-point raise, interest rate hike this year, and another, 15 basis points this year, and a quarter point next year. Given that the economy is strong, inflation seems to be getting up to the target. Do you see that pace is reasonable? Only 40 basis points of tightening by the end of 2018?
One at a time.
well, as you mentioned, this is the forecast. It's not a commitment. It's the forecast of our research department. And one of the advantages of monetary policy is that we meet quite often, and we decide about the policy according to developments. I should mention, though, that as you could see, this forecast was based on a path of inflation that will only get to the lower bound of our target towards the end of the year. So, and we have quite I would say, a deviation, substantial deviation from our target range. But we will be there to watch and see whether the developments in that front actually, if we move forward in terms of the inflation, we will take that into account in our policy.
My second question has to do with fiscal policy. The finance minister has said that he's going to consider further tax cuts. Do you agree with that, first of all? And secondly, do you know, there was a slide about public civilian spending being so low. Shouldn't that be where the money, the extra, the excess tax revenue go to, in your opinion?
Well, as I've been talking about it for quite a while, I think there is room for improvement of our social and public civilian services, and I would like to see higher efficient spending in that area. So I think in terms of the priorities, when you look, especially when you look at the longer term challenges, which I talked about, I think we need to improve in certain areas. So my preferences, I think, are quite clear. I should also say that we don't need extra stimulus of the economy, short-term stimulus, because as we've seen, we're pretty close to full employment. So in that respect, I think the direction would be to, if there are additional resources, to actually spend them, for example, on speeding up infrastructure. In other areas, you need to have a longer-term plan, and also to be sure that the additional revenues are not sort of one-off, but temporary higher revenues. Permanently, sorry, not temporary, but permanently higher revenues. Yeah.
One question it's two sort of questions connected, but Donald Trump sort of criticized the currency interventions of governments, that they're keeping the currency low on purpose, and also we've had Barry Topov recently give an interview saying that it's come to, it's about time to end this. Can you say something about that?
Sure. As you could see, our currency actually appreciated quite substantially over the last 2 or 3 years. We do not try to offset the fundamental economic forces that affect the currency, but we are operating in an environment where some of our trading partners are pursuing an extremely expansionary policy, both in terms of negative interest rate and quantitative easing, and obviously we have to take that into account in our policy, and that's what we do.
Okay, Dr. Flug, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. Thank you for your questions. See you next year. Hopefully, more good news. Thank you very much.
So. Thank you. איך קוראים לך? אוקיי, נעים מאוד. אמא בסדר, תודה. נכון, בדיוק. תודה, אני אגיד לה. שפגשתי אותך, בשמחה. יופי. No, 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 they're including, yeah. Yeah, but if they're not seeking work, then they're not unemployed.